Now, pre-tenancy. Now, with the Deregulation Act, a whole lot of stuff came in. And if you look at the market 20 years ago, or you bought one of these tenancy agreements from W.H. Smith or whatever, and you made 20 copies of them, and there you went. There were no such things as how to rent guides and restrictions on deposits. Now there's a whole lot of stuff. So the pre-tenancy setup is so important. And there are some key documents. So if you haven't served some of these, then you can't serve Section 21 notice. In other words, you have to pray that these tenants will fall into arrears so you can evict them. Because if you haven't served the how to rent guide, and be careful with how to rent guide, because the how to rent guide gets changed by the government several times a year sometimes, and they don't warn you. So unless you belong to a group like us professional agents do, we get warned because our organization warns us. But I've had tenants who, when they applied for the property 3 weeks before they moved in, I served them with a how to rent guide. And then the government brought out the new how to rent guide the day before they moved in. Thank heavens I got notified so that I could serve them the new one, because otherwise the whole thing would have been invalid. The deposit is another big one. There are many landlords who have missed this deposit thing. You have to serve the prescribed information around the deposit. And there's several other requirements as well. So you have to really look at your deposit scheme requirements. There are strict timelines. There's like 30 days, and that's not from when the tenancy started. So you need to safeguard that deposit 30 days after the deposit was paid. Not the holding deposit, the proper deposit was paid. So if the tenant moves in 3 weeks after the deposit was paid, you've only got 1 week to do the rest. You need to serve the certificate on them and make sure they know that you've done your side, and check those amounts, because you cannot, since the Deregulation Act, you cannot put more than 5 weeks rent into the deposit scheme. The deposit scheme will happily accept it, but you need to refund that balance to the tenant if you have made a mistake like that. And mistakes happen. The EPC is reasonably straightforward. The only thing is, a lot of landlords have got tenants in there for 20 years, whenever EPCs, I can't remember when EPCs came out, and they forgot to get an EPC for the property. So that EPC needs to be done. It doesn't need to be renewed if it expires during the tenancy. That's not a problem. But you need to prove that your property is an E or above. And let's hope this government doesn't bring in this C rubbish, because I don't know, a lot of our old properties are never going to pass a C, never. So let's hope they keep it at an E or a D. A D I can live with, not a C. So you need to serve that valid EPC before the tenancy starts. You can't serve it a day after. Actually needs to be done before the viewing. So the tenant needs to know that before they sign up for it. The danger here is old tenancies. So keep an eye for old tenancies, because it's important that everything is in place. So document number 4 is you also need to serve an up-to-date gas certificate. So tip, do not leave this to the last minute, because you get contractors, if your tenant is moving in 3 days, don't then suddenly send a gas engineer around to go do the gas certificate, because his van might break down, his equipment might break down, he must get ill. Then you're trying to find a new gas engineer. And if you don't have that gas certificate, you cannot let that tenant move in. You need to just tell them, sorry, you can't move in, because otherwise you'll never be able to evict them using the Section 21. I don't know what they're going to do if they do away with Section 21. I don't know. Make sure you include a copy of electrical certificate. It's not a requirement to serve the electrical certificate on the tenant before they move in, but it's just good practice. So give them an electrical certificate that is in date, it's passed everything. Make sure they sign for it, because then you know that you've done your thing. You've told them everything is safe in that property. They can't make accusation. Also, another good one to do is give them the head lease of the block of flats. Then they must adhere to the rules of that block of flats. No prams in the communal hallways, no hanging of the washing, no parking on certain bits. So they need to know what the rules are, because otherwise you'll get into trouble about your tenant's behavior, And if you've served this on them, at least you've covered your side. Now I'm going to be cheeky and squeeze in the inventories here. Now it's not a legal requirement, but if you don't have a signed inventory at the beginning, then you don't have proof of the smoke and the carbon monoxide detectors being in place. Inventory records all that. And if you do a proper check-in, you've got proof and people sign. It could be a cause for claims from tenants making false allegations, not being able to claim from a deposit. So I'm going to show you an interview with Hema. We record.
What I do is inventories and check-ins. The inventory is a condition report, so it's not just about taking photos and ticking the boxes. It's also looking at the condition of everything that I'm taking photos of. The reason why an inventory is very important, especially for our landlords, is to protect them. Because if we don't have the image and the proof of how the property was given to the tenant, when it comes to the end of the tenancy, it's going to be difficult to fight back in terms of getting deposit or help to pay for whatever damage, if any, from the deposit of the tenant. So it's really important to have that as proof. It's also very important to make sure that by the time I get to that property, the house is completely empty, no people, no cleaners, no contractors, and everything is all done and sorted. So I can get on and do the job.
How many hours does it take to do an inventory?
Well, it can vary between 1 hour and a half. Sometimes I've been in a property 4 hours, which is a killer, I'm not going to lie. In terms of, it's very tiring taking photos of all these different items, such as appliances, floors, switches, walls. All of these things have to be photographed. And it takes time, depending on the amount of bedrooms that we have at the property, if there is a garden, if there is a garage, and that kind of thing.
But I would say, why do you need to use that piece of software that you use?
The advantage of the software is basically that allows you to follow the right order when you get into the property, and also it gives you the guidance on how to take the photos, where to go when you finish one site, you go to the other, and it avoids for you to forgetting things. Then it asks you questions such as, what was made of this, the brand, what was the condition. So you have to enter all of these details as you are asked by the software. So it's a really good tool.
And it keeps it consistent, I suppose.
Absolutely, yes. Right? Once we have one property and we have done one inventory, within the same software, we can do the checkout. So obviously allows you to compare from one to the other. And that's the proof of the pudding. If you want to start charging the tenant, if anything, from their deposit for any damage or anything that they have done that they shouldn't, like, I don't know, writing on walls, these children. I have found, really dirty ovens when they were, really clean, and suddenly it's full of grease and hairs and you name it. So yes, it's a good tool, and that's an advantage. Also, when we do the inspections, you can compare what my colleague Kasia does with inspections against the inventory, and it's also very good because it's all split out in different ways. So if she just wants to see the kitchen because suddenly she has seen a crack on, I don't know, the induction hob, she can go direct into that and see this crack wasn't there. Alarm bells, let's do something about it. One of the worst ones is when I have been there and the tenant was still at the property and I had to get this inventory done because I have the next tenant moving in within hours. And this was one of the ones that took me the longest because it was a really big property. And this tenant was basically following me around every time I was taking photos. So if there was a little bit of toothpaste on the basin, he came and said, "Oh, don't take a photo, let's wipe it." So I did say, never again tenants there. It's really, really important. And we cannot be flexible with this, that property has been empty, professionally clean, either paid by the tenant or the deposit or whatever it is, but for me, it has to be ready to go. If we take photos of a dirty property on an inventory, the chances are that when the tenant is going to give that property back to the landlord, it's going to be dirty. And the landlord has to have, if they are taking a deposit, they are going to keep it in a deposit protection scheme by the government. And if they don't have an inventory, they are not going to be able to use any of that as proof. It's a great protection for them. It's great protection for the tenant because both of them will be protected. Also, when we do the inventory, we check all the smoke detectors, and that has to be done by law in front of the tenant. So on the inspection, we will ask the tenant to check if they know how to check. But on the inventory, I'm the one with my broomstick that goes like that and checks that everything is working in front of them. And then they have to sign and verify that. So it is very important. There are legalities involved. And for peace of mind, me as a landlord, I will definitely don't go without. Is there proof that the property was up to speed? God forbid the tenant becomes a horrible tenant and wants to say that the landlord gave the property with mold, or the windows weren't working, or the keys weren't there, or, the smoke alarm wasn't working, the CO detector wasn't in the kitchen, there is a photo, it's by the boiler, that kind of thing. You could find tenants that will use anything. If they don't like you or they want to have excuse not to pay the rent, they will use anything against the property. So the inventory will protect you because that's the proof that everything was up to speed and according to all the legalities and compliances.